The price of oil fell again today, still hovering around that $50 a barrel mark. Now, part of that's supply and demand. Part of it, though, is a general concern about the future of oil. Whether it's climate change or carbon taxes, investors are wary of putting their money into an industry with so many unknowns. Well, Jackie Forrest is the Director of Research at the ARC Energy Research Institute, and she's come up with a method to calculate the risks behind this type of investment. Jackie, how do you invest around so many unknowns?
Right, so commodity price is an unknown, and most experts think it's going to kind of stay at this level for a while. But there's other concerns too. So basically, the future greenhouse gas policy, what's that going to do in terms of changing the value of assets? Some people are even talking about, divestment is the only way to get rid of that risk, and that maybe some of today's reserves are going to be stranded assets in the future. We don't think that's the case, and that's why we came out with our method to help investors differentiate those assets that make sense longer term and those that are higher risk.
And divestment, I guess we're largely talking about, sort of like pension funds and university funds that have been talking about, we just need to get away from this altogether. You say you figured out where to bet, where not to bet. We'll break that down for us.
Right, and some are looking at it as just like no crude oil investing, but actually there's a couple of issues with that argument. One is, first of all, it sort of assumes that all crudes are the same, and that's not the case. There's a big difference in the greenhouse gas emissions that come from producing some of the lower carbon crudes to the higher carbon, about 4 times. And then the second thing is this view that there's going to be no oil demand 20 years from now. Well, even in the most stringent scenarios around the reduction of oil demand, there's still a lot of oil demand in the future, and there will be an oil company in the future that will be selling that product.
And I mean, is part of the concern here that if we see a divestment, then there wouldn't be as much money and as much capital for energy companies to be getting in at the sort of sharp end of the stick in terms of innovation and getting out ahead of a lot of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, at the macro scale, that is the goal of these divestment campaigns, is that they will starve the industry of capital, there will be less investment. But that doesn't really work, because that doesn't change the consumption side. And so really the demand is coming because people are using oil, not because people are investing in oil. And so we think that not all crude assets will be the same, but there will be demand for oil in the future, and there will be crude oil assets that we think could even be advantaged in a lower carbon world.
You talk about that in the report. You use the term higher carbon intensive sources. Which are the ones? And I guess, first of all, what's the importance of being able to identify which are those higher carbon intensive sources, which aren't, and how does that sort of fit into the model here?
Well, it really matters because I said there's a big dynamic range, almost a 4-fold difference in the carbon emissions from a higher carbon crude. And to give you an example, if you had a carbon tax of $50 per ton, which is what the federal government has mandated by 2023, for a low carbon crude oil, that'd be about the equivalent of $1.50 of extra cost just to pay that levy. For a high carbon crude oil, that could be like $6 per barrel of extra cost. And so you can see as an investor, if you had that higher carbon crude oil, that tax would really cut your cash flow, change the value of your investment. If you had a lower carbon crude oil, it would look very different.
And for people who are watching at home and trying to figure out, specifically what, are we talking about the shale oil play, are we talking about the oil sands? Like, what is an example of a lower carbon intensive oil here?
Some of the lowest carbon crude oil is the new light tight oil plays, so some of the crudes from the Bakken and Eagle Ford, and even some of the light tight oil plays that we have in here in Western Canada, like from the Cardium, and some of the liquids that are coming out of the Montney. Those are some of the lower carbon crudes. On the other end of the spectrum, some of the higher carbon crudes include heavy crudes from Venezuela, crude oils that use steam to bring them to the surface. So that happens in the Canadian oil sands, but also happens in the Middle East and other places in the world. And even some lighter crudes where there's a lot of flaring associated with the production or venting of methane. Those tend to be very high carbon as well.
And so, how does, put this into the broader picture and just sort of the evolution of Canada's energy sector and oil industry, what do the next 5 or 10 years look like as those sort of realities really do begin to settle in?
Right, so over the next 5-10 years, we expect in Canada to start to see a carbon tax kicking in. Now, the oil sands actually don't see the full carbon tax, but some of the other plays do. So we're going to see a higher burden associated with carbon levies. Over the next 10 years, we're still going to have a substantial amount of oil demand, so there's still going to be a market for the product, but you really are going to just be facing a higher levy carbon tax. And that's part of what our tool does, is allows investors to really understand, well, how much is that going to be? And then they can can go do the modeling to understand, well, what does that mean in terms of the value of my asset? So they don't have to worry about stranded assets. What they need, they can use a tool like this to really quantify how these policies are going to impact their investment returns.
As always, Jackie, you made me a little bit smarter today. Thanks for this.
Thank you, Peter, for the invitation.
Jackie Forrest, Director of Research at the ARC Energy Research Institute.